So why is nuclear energy making a comeback? Because apparently that's what the title of this video says. Something that should have never ceased.
Aging reactors, energy prices, disasters. Nuclear power has been falling out of favor in the US for decades. But the conversation is changing. The intensifying threat of global warming and the explosion of AI is boosting the outlook of nuclear energy. This is an inflection point.
They have to, because let's be completely honest with ourselves. Solar is probably the best source of the new source of energy, but it is so mediocre, like as of right now, that it cannot save us from anything. Not from global warming, not from energy crisis, not from higher prices. Because in the regions of the US where nuclear power plants have either shut down or never existed, prices of energy prices just have spiked because I mean unless you live near an oil refinery such as in Texas. But what I'm saying is nuclear is the only thing that can help.
But we will get to the point that by 2050 we have zero emissions.
More than 100 nations have set lofty net zero targets, forcing the world to weigh the inherent risks and high cost of atomic power, which has no carbon emissions. That includes the United States.
The climate change moment is upon us now, and we need to meet that moment today and decarbonize our grid. Solar power, wind power, battery storage, they should go as fast as they physically can. And even that's not going to be.
As far as I'm aware, wind power is absolutely horrendous. In certain regions of the world, where I think it is near China, I think, where there's like an absolute amount of wind turbines. The wind currents are starting to change a little, and that's starting to mess up the climate. Not to mention, whenever a wind turbine is retired, it becomes a ton of waste. It becomes trash, and that is also affecting, the quality of the earth.
Fast enough. So now we need to complement it with other tools like nuclear power.
When you start talking about decarbonizing our economy by 2050, you realize that's a huge challenge. You really need all of those technologies to come together to meet those kinds of goals.
Wrong. You only need nuclear, but you need a ton of it.
I think nuclear plays a very significant role in fighting climate change. It is already the largest source of clean electricity, and I think it'll continue to grow in that area.
If the United States wants to revive its nuclear industry, it will take a panoramic effort. That includes maintaining aging reactors, building new ones, and fostering various startups. But the country faces a gauntlet of issues in order to convert that enthusiasm into results. The US first commercialized nuclear fission energy in the 1950s. It was a remarkable feat of engineering to capture energy created by splitting uranium.
Most of the plants they started building up
Also, don't we have nuclear fusion now? What happened to that?
in the late 60s and into the 1970s. At its peak, we had 112 operating nuclear reactors. And in 1979, we had the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident, and the US nuclear industry pretty much ground to a halt.
3 Mile Island caused widespread panic at the time, and though the crisis is now declared over, it's left a question mark over the whole future of the American power industry.
We saw 13 reactors shut down from 2013 to 2022, mostly for economic reasons, because nuclear power plants, they're expensive to operate, and natural gas was becoming cheaper, wind and solar were becoming more common and cheaper.
Today, the US has 94 operating reactors, generating around 20% of the country's electricity.
Let me put it this way. Nuclear isn't expensive. It just needs an insane amount of volume. In other words, you need a nuclear power plant right next to a city in order for it to be economical. You need a lot of people to be connected to it. But due to the, scary reputation of nuclear energy, everybody's scared of having a nuclear power plant near a city, even though nuclear is by far one of the safest sources of energy.
If the US wants to increase its nuclear power output, the first step is maintaining or even reopening aging reactors. Oconee Nuclear Station in South Carolina was part of that first wave of nuclear plants. Its first reactor began operation in 1973.
The Oconee plant in South Carolina, for a long time, was the biggest nuclear power plant in the United States. It's your standard light water reactor. That's the conventional model that we're using in all of the power plants in the United States today. Nuclear power plants in the US get licensed for 40 years. When they started building them in the 60s and 70s, that was kind of the expectation. Let's take them for 40 years and see what happens after that. Most of them have now been extended even longer than that.
Today, utility companies are investing in their nuclear plants like Oconee so they can run for 80 years and maybe even longer. But back in the early 2010s, that wasn't the case. The industry was beleaguered by competition from cheaper natural gas and renewable wind and solar, and rattled by the disaster at Fukushima.
Wait a second. The way that they say, rattled by cheap natural gas, and pairing that up with the date of 2010, isn't that when Russia was the dominant energy producer in the world or something like that? They were just pumping oil and gas into the world market like crazy.
No one was fighting to keep an old nuclear plant open.
While we were seeing all of these plants close, the other side of the coin is that we weren't seeing any new construction of new power plants either.
President George W. Bush launched the Nuclear Power 2010 program as a response to that downturn. Only 2 utilities heeded his call, and one of them reached the finish line. Southern Company completed their expansion of Vogtle in early 2024 with reactors 3 and 4, but it came in 7 years behind schedule and more than double its $14 billion budget. Meanwhile,
Corruption, maybe?
dozens of nuclear reactors were shelved by investors who faced ballooning budgets. It's remarkable that 2 reactors were completed at the Vogtle site. They might be the last large reactors built in the U.S. for a long time.
So the construction certainly did have challenges. This was a first-of-a-kind nuclear unit in the United States. We had to restart a supply chain, retrain workers on the specifics of nuclear construction, and then an unforeseen global pandemic occurred. Our primary contractor filed bankruptcy. So certainly these were challenges, some of which we expected, some of which we didn't, but we navigated them. I think it's absolutely a monumental accomplishment, and it's so important to prove that building nuclear power in the United States is possible. And I do hope that other utilities and companies in the country, as well as around the world, will continue to benefit from the lessons learned from Vogtle 3 and 4 and build more nuclear generation.
So wait a second. You're telling me that the United States, the country that came up with nuclear power, lost the ability to build nuclear power plants? See how I mentioned about Russia and how they pumped insane amount of oil and gas into the world economy? Well, guess what? As of right now, Rosatom, their nuclear government-owned company, is the largest nuclear manufacturer in the entire planet. So, I don't know, I guess the US just doesn't have their priorities straight.
There's a lot of interest in whether we can build another one of these big nuclear power plants in the United States. But the utilities, they're the ones who would have to write the check. And they are not lining up to take on one of these projects. They're wary of a price tag that would be in the tens of billions of dollars.
If Vogtle is the last big nuclear reactor built in the United States, startups are trying to fill in the gap. They are developing new, smaller reactor designs for the next generation of the country's nuclear fleet.
They're called SMRs, that's a small modular reactor. The basic idea is that you mass produce the components in a factory, and then you can put them on a truck or put them on a barge and deliver them to the site where it's all bolted together. So that's supposed to be faster, easier, and most importantly, cheaper. Kairos is one of at least a dozen companies that are developing new reactor technologies.
I don't know how I feel about mass manufactured nuclear power plant. I feel like it's more prone to break down. It's less likely to make a severe damage, like the Fukushima power plant. Maybe it's less um, catastrophic, but it does sound like it would still break down more frequently.
They're developing a completely different technology. It uses molten fluoride salt as a coolant instead of water. But the key is that they can build them in a factory and send them out to wherever they need to be installed. The next step for Kairos is going to be at Oak Ridge Labs in Tennessee, where they're going to build their first test reactor.
Experts predict we'll have a functioning small modular reactor by the mid-2030s. Bill Gates recently announced TerraPower, a startup he founded, broke ground for its first commercial reactor in Wyoming. A leading project from NuScale was terminated in late 2023, a victim of inflation and elevated interest rates.
Okay, so I understand that companies can struggle during these times, especially the ones that are focused in more niche topics. But my question is, what has the United States done to help these companies that clearly want to help stabilize the energy supply of the United States? Because let's be real, a lot of people criticize the US for sending aid to other countries in insane amounts while there's natural disasters here. But what about all the money that's been going to DEI or other forms of propaganda? Why don't they use that money to help startups at least survive and finish their projects, see if they can succeed?
The US government is vital to the success and potential growth of the nuclear industry. Its support in approval licenses and funding is the only way these projects ever reach the finish line. Looking forward to the new administration, Republicans have generally supported nuclear energy, but President-elect Donald Trump has given mixed signals.
These things ended up costing $25 billion, and one of them never got opened.
So it's been an extraordinary change from when I grew up in small town Sterling, Illinois, to, really seeing this renaissance of interest.
Especially for someone who's been in the industry for a while, because we went through this period, 2009, 2010, where the nuclear renaissance phrase got thrown around a lot. And it didn't come to fruition at that point in time. But I will say I am very optimistic.
Okay, so I guess the government is supporting them. Then why do they still fail if the government is supporting them? This is starting to sound kind of strange, kind of shady.
So whether it is our involvement with the Vogtle nuclear plant and seeing that all the way through, or restarting nuclear power plants, or building new nuclear power plants using next generation technologies, I think we end up being a sounding board for the entire nuclear industry. Today, I would say nuclear power has just as much support as every other clean technology. We need to get to a place where independent power producers in deregulated states can build a reactor. The Loan Programs Office really is here to serve folks who decide to try to borrow money from our office. But ultimately, the decision around whether we're actually in a nuclear renaissance is the decision of the utility companies and others who have to come to us for a loan.
It's difficult to predict if the refound enthusiasm for nuclear power will be matched by utilities and entrepreneurs. The demand for carbon-free electricity is increasing, but it's difficult to stomach a multi-billion-dollar bill and decades-long timetable for a nuclear reactor.
Well, I mean, a lot of countries are doing exactly that, so I don't see what the problem is. Like, I know that this is one of the things that a lot of Chinese brag about, like their country actually planning ahead decades in advance. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily what the United States needs to do. Even though it is beneficial, I'm not necessarily saying that. What I am saying is the US should put a greater incentive for corporations to basically take this more seriously. How would I say this? Um, Not regulation, but rather administration. Yes, that doesn't sound like a capitalist system, but recently we haven't been going we haven't been necessarily the government hasn't necessarily been complying with capitalism. So all I'm saying is, for the sake of the survival of important industries such as nuclear, maybe the United States does need to have longer contracts or like actual contracts rather than loans to these companies. And through these contracts, the US should have some sort of oversight.
Experts say the upswing in nuclear power plant construction needs to continue to both meet net zero emissions goals by 2050 and ultimately to help smooth the world's transition to renewable energy.
So even with all the excitement for nuclear energy these days, there are still some important environmental groups like Sierra Club, Greenpeace. They are staunchly opposed to nuclear energy. They're still concerned about all of the risks.
Nuclear power and radioactive waste are inherently dangerous. The risks of atomic reactor meltdowns are radioactivity escaping into the environment to contaminate the drinking water supply, contaminate the food supply.
But don't we have built-in measures for this? If I'm not mistaken, the Fukushima power plant was defective from the start. It was built wrong. But I'm pretty sure that in the US, power plants are built to accommodate for these sort of accidents.
Contaminate the air that you breathe, and it's been known for decades that any exposure to ionizing radioactivity, no matter how small the dose, carries a risk of cancer causation. Our movement across the country and across the world supports renewables complemented by efficiency and storage. That covers the reliability aspect. In fact, internationally and in the United States, renewables like wind and solar are growing by leaps and bounds, where the nuclear power industry has enjoyed the lion's share of subsidies.
I'm gonna just be honest. I see nuclear and solar as the future of energy sources for the world. But it is so ridiculous that people still think that wind is a viable source. If nothing else, the only natural source that makes sense is hydropower through dams. But even that causes damage to people's livelihood because now you're redirecting water. So, causing certain areas to dry up, areas that would have otherwise had access to that water. So that's all I'm saying.
So when I started writing about nuclear energy in 2019, the only real story was which reactor was going to get shut down next because they were so expensive to operate. But today the narrative has completely reversed. Now the story is who's going to extend their license for another 20 years? Who's going to be the first to build another big nuclear power plant?
There's been a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of cheerleading in the nuclear power industry. What the country needs to do is to stop, build a reactor, and generate electricity. There's a real regulatory and social and political gauntlet that nuclear power plant developers need to run through. I remain optimistic about nuclear power, but it's taking much longer than I had expected. And I'm concerned about rising costs due to inflation and high interest rates.
Another thing is, because right now we're using fission nuclear energy. Once fusion comes along, then the problem of radiation should pretty much not disappear, but definitely calm down, because fusion produces way less radiation than fission.
What I see happening in the next 5 years is the reopening of several retired nuclear power plants, perhaps 3. And after 2030, I anticipate that we'll start to see some of the advanced and small modular reactors coming online. Right now, most of the interest in the nuclear space surrounds fission, but one cannot disregard all the companies that have raised about $7.1 billion to commercialize fusion.
There you go. That's what I'm talking about.
fusion offers a very, very promising solution as well. And that could be an additional nuclear technology that contributes to address challenges of climate change.
Forget climate change. The biggest problem right now is that there's not enough electricity for the AI boom and people's livelihoods. So that's the main concern in my mind. And that's it. But you see what I mean? Like there needs to be a source of energy that can support the entire country. You can't just suddenly steal people's electricity and feed it into producing more advanced AIs or data centers. That's just not fair. So yes, the US needs to find a more viable solution for energy. And no, I don't think wind, hydropower, or coal. Bro, I can't believe that coal is still being used to this day. It's such an inefficient way to get electricity, not to mention oil. Gas makes sense, but those other two, they don't make a lot of sense, especially for a modern society.